whenever, for instance, there are World Cup games, he stays alone because even the lawyers cannot visit him. What we have to understand is that we are not in a regular procedure. Lula, I think, is bigger than prison itself. Lula would be entitled to be somewhere else as a commander, former commander-in-chief, but Lula, as already said, has no right in Brazil. Lula is a citizen that's that's beneath the law, and therefore nothing applies.
Excuse me.
Clarification then. In other words, the imposition of solitary confinement is totally arbitrary, according to the judge in any case. There are no guidelines that you can refer to contest it, not to mention any legal provisions.
Not to mention Mandela. We also have the Mandela rules, we cannot forget, that do not provide for solitary confinement for any prisoner. But we are trying to, there is a judge who's in charge of the execution of the sentence, and she's not allowing him to have any more visitors. This is the strict rules of his confinement. Only visitors by a lawyer, only visited by a lawyer, 2 friends a week, half an hour each, and family on Thursday.
But there are no legal grounds on which you can contest this anywhere.
Well, we are contesting it. Well, we are contesting it, but not very, we're not obtaining a lot of success in it.
Okay.
America.
And the USA.
Well, the USA is something that should be actually analyzed, because we have a very troubling speech made by the DOJ prosecutor, Kenneth Blanco. It's something that we actually filed before the appellate court, where he explains that the DOJ, the Department of Justice from the United States, has an informal cooperation agreement with the car wash operation. And by informal, I would like actually that he explained, because our rules, we have a treaty by dated 1997, which regulates how evidence should be shared and in terms of cooperation between the United States and Brazil. Informally, what he means is illegally. So we need an explanation. We have been denied such explanation, and I think not only Lula needs an explanation, but all of the Brazilians need an explanation. What is the Department of Justice? How is the Department of Justice cooperating informally with the car wash operation prosecutors and members? And we are being constantly denied such explanation. It's called the conspiracy theory, but it's actually not, because there are at least 5 speeches made by members of the Department of Justice of the United States stating that informal cooperation took place, and actually the informal cooperation is the reason of the success of the car wash operation. How a member of the DOJ can claim that he helped construct the conviction against Lula, constructs the case against Lula, and we are constantly being denied such explanation. Again, it's more questions than answers, but I think Brazilians as well as Americans need to know how this cooperation and why this informal cooperation took place and is taking place.
Thank you. Another question? No. Yes, please.
According to the Brazilian law, Lula can run the election or not. I think it is not clear, no? But I would like to know why it's not clear.
Well, the Constitution says that that an individual's political right may not be removed unless by a final appealable decision. That's what the Constitution says. But we have a law called Clean State, which goes against the Constitution and says that once one person may not become eligible after a conviction by an appellate court. This is the clean slate law. There are many, in the doctrine, many, of course, variations, but we do believe that the law is unconstitutional. What Article 25 of the Pact states is that Lula's political right may not be removed unless preceded by a fair trial. And if this trial is anything but fair since the start, I would say Lula should not have been prosecuted to start with, because as we had explained, all of the illegalities, arbitrarities that were committed in the investigative phase would nullify the entire procedure. So Lula's political right should not be removed according to Brazilian law or international human law standards. And this is something that we are going to fight so that he may run and be in office once again.
It's a very complicated situation looking at it from the outside, and it's going to come to a crunch very quickly and very worryingly in September, because this is the timetable. The candidates for presidency register in August. The election is in October. There is an electoral court based of judges plucked from here and there, which has to decide in September, in a few weeks, whether an objection to a candidate is going to be successful. Now, an objection to Lula would be based on the clean hands law, but the Constitution overrides any other law, so they're going to have to go up to the Supreme Court in record time in September to decide whether the clean hands law, which would disqualify Lula from standing, is in fact unconstitutional, which, in my view,
So it's the Supreme Court which will decide.
Yes. So, and it has very little time to do so. And whether, if Lula is disqualified in a great rush, no doubt his supporters will take to the streets. And there is, Valesky, you might say a word about it, there is some attempt to short-circuit this by having the Supreme Court in July, and it's meant to be on holiday, actually make a ruling.
Well, actually, even if you consider the clean slate law, this sentence, this conviction, should not have any effect because it's unlawful. And the probability, and it's not final, and the probability of reversal of such sentence, of such conviction, is so high that it should not have any effects, neither in prison, in terms of his liberty, or any other effect that would restrict any rights from Lula.
Okay, may I?
Sure.
Yes.
Vice President.
3 more questions. What about the inter-American human rights system? Have you made appeal to them for a ruling of some sort that would back up your own claims? Second, who were the observers, the international observers at the trial, and what have been their reactions? For example, has Amnesty International said something, considering that they focus on political prisoners? And third, where is he kept in prison, and how easy or difficult is it for his family or anybody else to get to him?
You answer that, and I'll do the best too.
Well, he's been kept in prison in Curitiba, which makes it very hard for the lawyers to go there, for the family to travel every week to see him. So all of this is also against the Brazilian law. But again, this is, how a trial of exception works. There is no law for the defendant. It all makes it very costly. Also, flying or even driving down to Curitiba takes money. And all of his assets have been frozen. So every bit of difficulty or hard time Lula and his families are facing at this point.
Okay, it's a good question, no, two good questions. The first one was whether we had considered going to the Inter-American Court, which is there for Latin America. Yes, we did, very carefully. But the problems with the Inter-American Court are considerable. Most seriously, delay. The Inter-American Court gave a very important decision in the case of Isha against Brazil. It was a case that began in 1997, and the decision wasn't handed down until 2009. It was a 12-year delay. What that decided, Mr. Isha was one of the group of protesters on behalf of poor peasants, and the investigating judge, exactly like Judge Moro, had intercepted the telephone calls and given them to newspapers, and the court condemned Brazil for doing that, and that. So, unfortunately, powerless was the Inter-American Court decision that Judge Moro felt he could simply ignore it and do exactly the same thing. So there were two reasons, or three really, and the third reason was you cannot bring two cases at once. You cannot, as it were, sue in two courts at the same time. You have to choose your remedy. And because of the delays in the Inter-American Court process, because of the ineffectual content of Inter-American decisions in Brazil, and finally because we couldn't go to the UN if we went to Inter-American Court, we decided to go to the UN. But we couldn't go to both. The Inter-American Court has, of course, more recently become very disturbed by its president has had to resign, and there have been serious problems, but I don't think they were in view at the time we made our decision. No. The other question was observers. I did try to encourage the International Bar Association to send observers. However, the problem, and I myself have been an observer in many cases going back 20 or 30 years, initially in South Africa. The problem is that you can't, as an observer, stay there for months. How long did Lula's case take?
2 years.
2 years. The only organizations like the International Bar Association and Amnesty simply can't do observations of very long trials done in this way. I certainly remember being an observer in a trial that took a week, but otherwise it's very hard to have people of the, if you like, the distinction you need as an independent observer. The other problem was Portuguese. Brazil speaks Portuguese, and Portuguese is not an international language. So it would have been necessary to find an independent Portuguese-speaking lawyer who had a long time available, because observers aren't paid. So I think they were some of the problems that were faced by the IBA.
If I may then, What about Amnesty International? Don't they have a chapter in Brazil, someone permanently there, the International Bar Association? And then what about appealing to someone such as Glenn Greenwald, who is, by this point, pretty close to bilingual, Brazilian, Portuguese, and the United States English, and who has repeatedly shown himself to be an advocate for such cases and who lives in Brazil? I mean, aren't there people there who don't need visas or whatever? And a third point then, I've known of people who went to Guatemala to monitor trials from the United States, and they had to go in and out. And they went and then they came back and whatever. And of course it was costly and whatever, but that was the way they were able to remain in place long enough without arriving at complications with visas or residency visas or anything like that. There must be some way around this that you could call in these people or mobilize people there in Brazil who have the status and reputation and whose presence there could circumvent these difficulties.
Yes, interesting you mentioned Glenn Greenwald, because he did, in fact, write quite a number of pieces I have seen condemning the prosecution and saying in more vigorous terms than I have that it was unfair and a persecution. And so, yes, there are many voices in Brazil, particularly of some of the most distinguished law professors who write, who sign letters, who write books. There was a book produced of a dozen or so law professors who condemned the illegality of Judge Mouro's conduct. But they, in the present arrangement in Brazil, have only persuasive power and not very much. Yeah.
We, as Lula's lawyer, welcome any kind of international observers, any investigative journalist who would like to analyze the documents, go over all the depositions. We're absolutely open to it. And something that we've been trying to get attention from the international media to analyze the trial. We get lost in translation, not only from Portuguese to the other languages of the world, but we also get lost in translation in terms of the legalish. All of the legal technical terms are very hard for the population to understand. And this is it's a way that law firm works. You can do whatever, take any arbitrary action, and you'll be lost in translation with the public. When you, for instance, now, when you try to explain all of the technicalities of all of the legal appeals from the appellate court in the Superior Court of Justice and Supreme Court, people literally get lost. I cannot forget when we discovered the document that proved that Lula could not have ever owned the beach apartment. The name of the document was so technical that I think I got the people were lost by the second word. So all of this makes it very hard for people to understand what is really going on in the trial. We are now in a debate only amongst lawyers, legal scholars, legal professors, and this is something that helps to proliferate the arbitrarities that happen in the car wash operation. But not only a book on the legal procedures, on how wrong the procedures were taken by Judge Mouro, but there was another book also made by 100 jurists on the arbitrarities of the first conviction. Constantly, and I would say on a daily basis, jurists write to newspapers, to blogs, to legal blogs, criticizing the methods, illegalities, and constitutionalities of the car wash operation. But this is what we have been living in Brazil. The press, parts of the press in Brazil, also just create a distortion on what's happening in the procedure, trying to pass on the idea that corruption is being fought fairly when it's not. There's a political persecution, an unfair persecution against a political figure in Brazil. So it makes it very hard, but that's why the fight goes on.
Can I add this thought, because I've been a trial observer for 40 years, and I think there is another explanation. It's the C word, corruption. There was the appeal lasted a day, and I was the only observer, international observer in court. I had a translator, and I saw with my own eyes the bias of the court, with the prosecutor sitting with the judges and going out and having coffee and lunch with the judges. I saw the judges unroll their already written judgment. 5 minutes after the defence had its 15 minutes, So I was able to see the farce, but there was no one else. The IBA, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty could all have attended the day and didn't, in the court of the judge who in the press had just said that Moro's judgment was impeccable and unappealed. So I think my mind went back to Czechoslovakia, actually, in the 1980s, when I was working with Václav Havel, and until then, the Stalinists in power in Czechoslovakia had been prosecuting the Jazz Society and groups of liberals on the basis that they were spreading subversion, censorship. That was why Havel and others went to prison. But they started a new tactic in the mid-1980s of prosecuting for fraud or corruption. And they prosecuted the Jazz Society for corruption, for taking fees. But the Jazz Society was a non-profit making organization. But it enabled, whenever this was raised at human rights bodies about how Czechoslovakia was putting in prison people for free speech or free music, they'd say, oh no, it's corruption, a crime in your country too. And so I think there is, for an establishment that wants to destroy a radical, progressive, whatever, movement, using the C word, corruption, is a very clever tactic, because it does tend to deter people. Lula's a politician. Politicians, many, most perhaps, are corrupt. This is something that is almost almost when a politician is on trial for corruption, there is a kind of popular presumption that he's guilty. And so I think that may be, because so many are, and that may be one reason why at that level human rights groups have been less keen to see the miscarriage of justice. But nonetheless, once you go into it, I think any fair-minded person will realize that this is a frame-up.
Okay, thanks. If there is no more questions, we will conclude. Maybe the last one.
Talk about the role of the media in this from the outset. There's some, because, well, this is the press club, and you did mention the distortion in the media. Could you give us a summary, at least, of how the media have treated this, because that obviously is a major factor in public perception?
Well, parts of the media in Brazil have had a decisive role in the conviction of Lula. They created the presumption of guilt even before the procedure had started, even before he had been investigated. And on a daily basis, the media repeats over and over and over again that the prosecution was fair, the procedure was fair. They distort, even today, they were talking about the fact that Lula was convicted of the possession of the apartment, which was never proven, not even in the sentence. So the constant distortion of what happens in the procedure, the constant raising of suspicions, different suspicions on a daily basis, does tend to violate the presumption of innocence that Lula has, and to help have a biased judge convict him on a meritless case. And this is how it works on every single case against Lula. And this is something that's not only happening in Brazil, but other places of Latin America, and should also be analyzed by the international media.
Yeah, I think it is a very significant factor. The global media, which is more right-wing than the Murdoch press and Fox News, played an important part in the demonization of Lula. From years before he was even charged, they constructed Lula prison dolls, dolls of Lula in prison uniform, which were turned by someone, we don't know who, into dolls, inflatable rubber dolls, which sometimes of 6 foot or so, which were held aloft at demonstrations, right-wing demonstrations of Lula in prison garb. And so this kind of media creating expectations that he would be convicted was certainly a factor. Plus the idolization, iconization of Judge Moro. Always, whenever you went into a bookshop in Brazil, you'd see pictures of Moro with an Eliot Ness pose, the great crime buster of America, the square jaw. And yet, this man is so monstrously unfair. He might be a good, obsessed prosecutor. That's his role. But to make him a judge is to make Brazil justice a laughingstock.
Okay, last question.
Just tomorrow. I believe have other well-known human rights organizations involved, like Human Rights Watch. And the second question, what's the next steps? Legal.
Again, we welcome any international human rights organization to be involved, and if they want to analyze. They haven't. Again, I think Jeffrey's explanation was, I think, the correct one. I think the C word really does take a toll in raising awareness of what's happening with Lula. Well, in terms of next steps, we are now updating the United Nations as to the non-compliance of Brazil to its May 22nd decision. And we are now, as you all know, in legal recess in Brazil, legal vacation for a month. But we are we'll keep on fighting and fighting all of the appeals that are necessary to preserve Lula's rights, and once the violations occur. And this is something that has to be explained. People are counting how many appeals we filed. But they do not ask. There were the same amount of violations that occurred. If a violation occurs, and illegality occurs, the role of the lawyer is to appeal. The fact that the people are trying to intimidate, the press is trying to intimidate the defense team in Brazil to not appeal, to allow illegalities to occur against Lula is, again, one more troubling effect of this rule by law, of this state of exception that we are now living in. And it's something that should be always refuted by the citizens of Brazil, and should be taken notice by the international community as well.
And one thing that is and should be clear, there are ways of finessing these situations. In Malaysia, Anwar, in Ibrahim, in prison for years, runs in an election with Dr. Mahathir, is the president in waiting. What happens? He's pardoned and out of prison so that he can serve the country. And possibly you could look at that as a solution. But this is interesting. That's not for Lula. He is determined to prove his innocence. That was his objective. He doesn't want this, some sort of deal. He doesn't want this kind of compromise. He wants his innocence to be proven. And although we have no money to do it,
Yeah.
we, we believe in it,
harder.
and so that's why we'll fight on.
Okay. So thanks a lot for your comments and presentation. We hope all the best. It's now the third time we welcome you for a press conference about Lula, and we hope.
Hope there will be no
it will-
fourth time.
Yeah, yeah.
Lula himself will
Yeah,
be here.
himself.
if there's a
we
fourth
should
time.
like to welcome him, yes, as a president.
Yes, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks to everybody, and so wish you all the best. Okay.
Thank you so much.